welcome. In this lecture, we'll continue our discussion on linking plots and we'll look at linked brushing. In the previous lecture, we looked at linked panning, and in this lecture, we'll look at link brushing. So let's go to the documentation and see what linked brushing is. Linked brushing is expressed by sharing data sources between glyph renderers. And one thing we need to do for linked brushing is that our bokeh needs to understand that selections that are acted on one glyph are passed to all other glyphs. And for that, to share data, we need to create them by hand and then pass them. For that, we'll be using the column data source method. Okay? So that's how we can create a data source for our data. That way it can be shared. Okay, so this is what linked brushing looks like. So you can select any section on one of your plots and then, it will be selected on your other figure also. Let's see an example. So the first thing we need to do is import all the libraries that you need. I just copied this from the previous lecture from bokeh.io. Import output and show, import figure from bokeh.plotting, and import grid plot from bokeh.layouts. And one additional thing we need to import is the column data source from bokeh models. Okay, so from bokeh.models, import column data source. So we use this column data source method to share our data across the various figures. Let's run this, and we'll use the same X and Y values that we have from our previous lecture. So we have X is a list containing these numbers, and we have our Y0, or not Y, or Y0. We have our Y0 and Y1. Okay, we'll use those. So the first thing we need to do is create our data source. We need to create that and pass it. Okay, so for that, we'll use the column data source method. So column data source, and we'll pass data and set it to be equal to dictionary. So we'll use the dictionary method to associate our data. So we'll set X to be equal to X, our Y0 to be equal to Y0, and our Y1 will be equal to Y1. And once we finish that, we can simply create our figure object and save it in a variable. So this time, let's save it in a variable called first. We'll create two figure objects. So we have our figure, and then we'll pass the plot width and plot height attributes. So for plot width, we'll set it to be equal to 255, and for plot height, we'll set it to be 250. And last time we saw that we can pass the tools attribute and then pass any tool that we want to see as a string. So let's say we want to see the reset tool and pan. So I'll just pass reset and pan. And we have our plot width, we have our plot height, and once we create our figure object, we can then call whatever marker that we want to see. So let's call the circle marker. So first that circle, and then pass your X and Y values. So we have X, and then Y0, and let's pass let's call the size attribute and size and pass 13. Let's set the color to red, and the last attribute that we need to pass is the column data source here. So for column data source, I'll save it in a variable called source here. So we can simply call the source attribute and set it to be equal to source. Okay, that's for our first figure, and let's do the same thing for our second figure. So to save some time, I'll just copy this entire thing, paste it here, and I'll save our second figure in a variable called second, and we'll set it to be equal to figure. We'll pass the tools attribute and pass reset and pan. Plot width and plot height is the same, and then we'll say second and then pass any marker that you want, square, circle, whichever you like. So second.square, we have x value, and then for our y value it will be y1, and size, let's say 13. Let's change the color to blue or any color you like, and we have our source. Now that we have our two figures, the next thing we need to do is call the grid plot method. So we have our grid plot, and then pass our two figures, which are first and second, and let's save this in a variable called final. And the last thing we need to do is call the show method and then pass our final figure. Now let's run this, and we have our two figures. So if we try to, here let's use the same marker, so second.circle. Let's run it again. Okay, now we should be able to, it looks like it's not doing any brushing. Yeah, that's because so we have missed to add one tool to our tools attribute. Okay, let me copy this and then include the tool known as the lasso select. So let's add that too. So the tool is called lasso underscore select. That's the one that will help us select any part in our figure. So let's run this again. Okay, now we should be able to, where's the lasso select? So we can point on the lasso select and then select any part on your figure. So this is what linked brushing is. You see, you select any part, and then all the associated parts on your second figure will also be selected and brushed. Okay, since they are shared by using the column data source. So if you reset this and select the lasso select, and if you do the same thing to all the other parts, okay, whatever area that matches to the first figure will also be selected. So this is what linked brushing is. Okay, lasso select. You see what, whenever I select certain areas in the first figure, all the associated areas are also selected and then brushed on your second subfigure. Okay, so this is what linked brushing is. So just to recap, don't forget the column data source method, because that's the method that we use to share the data between our figures. Okay, and you can look at the documentation here for linked brushing and linked panning. You can look at the examples here. We saw similar examples in our lectures. So here you have lasso select. You can select certain area and then the associated area will be selected and brushed in your subfigure too. Great. So that's what I have for the lecture on linked brushing.